It was another ordinary day in London, or so it seemed, until a familiar figure walked through the door, blending into the crowd without the usual spotlight. Jason Statham, dressed casually in a leather jacket and jeans, stepped into a quiet cafe nestled in the heart of the city. But what was he really doing here? Was he just another coffee seeker, or was there something more behind his visit? The air seemed to buzz with the energy of people lost in their own worlds, students buried in books, professionals deep in conversation, tourists seeking warmth from the cold. Jason wasn't here for his usual pick-me-up or to escape the chaos of fame. Today, he wasn't the famous action star that people recognized. Today, he was just another man, blending into the background, observing quietly. His presence, unnoticed by most, was part of a larger plan, an experiment, a test of human nature, empathy, and judgment. But who was really being tested here? The strangers around him? Or himself? Sitting at a corner table, Jason ordered a simple coffee, his eyes scanning the room as he prepared for what was about to unfold. The cafe, with its low hum of chatter, would soon become the stage for something that would challenge everything about how we perceive others and how quickly we judge. What would happen when a stranger's life story collided with their assumptions about those around them? Jason, just an observer, knew that this moment would change the course of the day for both him and a complete stranger. As Jason took a sip of his coffee, he couldn't help but wonder, how much do we really know about the people around us? And what happens when you strip away everything, leaving only raw, unfiltered human connection? Not long after Jason settled into his seat by the window, the quiet hum of the cafe was interrupted by the slow, eerie creak of the door. Heads turned, and an uneasy shift spread through the room. A man walked in, tall and broad, his rough presence immediately commanding attention. His name was Trevor. Wearing a weathered leather jacket and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, Trevor carried with him the aura of bitterness, like a dark cloud trailing behind him. His face, hardened by years of anger and resentment, told a story no one cared to read. He had a reputation that followed him everywhere, a man full of hate, especially toward those who didn't look like him. He was a man who had made his stance on race loud and clear, a stance everyone in the neighborhood had learned to avoid. But here he was, in the same cafe as Jason, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Trevor's boots thudded heavily against the floor as he approached the counter, his scowl sending a clear message to everyone: "Stay out of my way." The regulars in the cafe reacted immediately, bodies stiffening, eyes avoiding him, as if pretending he wasn't there would somehow make him disappear. The once cozy cafe had turned cold, and Jason could feel it too. But instead of recoiling like everyone else, he watched, intrigued. The barista, who usually greeted customers with a smile, barely acknowledged Trevor as he placed his order in a low, gruff voice. His eyes swept the room, filled with disdain. No one made an effort to meet his gaze. They knew better. Trevor was a man wrapped tightly in his bitterness, someone who had shut out the world long ago. He wasn't just angry, he was lost. Rejected by society for his views and violent outbursts, Trevor had chosen hatred as his shield against the pain life had thrown his way. But Jason saw something else. He wasn't here to pass judgment or meet Trevor's bitterness with the same cold indifference the others did. Jason had seen Trevor before, knew the kind of man he was, but today felt different. Today, Jason felt like he was witnessing something bigger than just another hostile encounter. Was this the moment something changed? Trevor stood at the counter, waiting for his drink, oblivious to the fact that every eye in the cafe was on him, even if they pretended otherwise. Jason could sense the unspoken tension, the way people were silently begging for the moment to pass, for Trevor to leave without causing a scene. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Trevor than what met the eye. Could this be the moment someone finally broke through to him? Jason's heart raced, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. He wasn't afraid of Trevor, but he was keenly aware of the opportunity standing in front of him. This wasn't just another angry man walking into a cafe. This was someone who had been broken by life, someone whose soul had been hardened by years of rejection. Jason had seen this kind of pain before. What if today was the day something finally shifted? As Trevor's drink was placed in front of him, Jason made a decision. He wasn't going to sit back and watch another moment of anger unfold without trying to make a difference. The cafe buzzed with unease, but Jason remained steady. What if today was the day someone chose to see Trevor not for his anger, but for his humanity? He knew it wouldn't be easy. Changing a man's heart never was. But sometimes, all it took was a single act of kindness to begin unraveling years of pain. The question that lingered in Jason's mind wasn't if Trevor could change, but how. How could one moment, one gesture make a difference in a man so consumed by hatred? And more importantly, what would happen next? Would Trevor respond with more bitterness, or would he finally see that someone was willing to look beyond his anger? Jason felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Trevor, this was about everyone in the cafe, everyone who had already written Trevor off. But Jason hadn't, and he wasn't ready to let this moment pass without seeing what might happen if someone chose to care. What if today was the start of something new? Trevor's drink in hand, he turned to leave, but Jason felt the tension building. The scene wasn't over. Would Trevor leave as quietly as he came, or was something bigger about to unfold? The tension in the cafe grew palpable as Trevor, disheveled and clearly battling his own demons, took a seat in the far corner. Heads turned slightly, whispers exchanged as the air thickened with unease. Jason could feel it all, the silent judgment from the cafe patrons, their eyes darting between him and Trevor, wondering if he'd ignore the man or step in. Should he let Trevor stew in his bitterness and isolation, as society so often did, or should he engage, despite knowing it might lead to confrontation? Jason's pulse quickened, but his expression remained composed as he made the decision. With a calm resolve, he stood up, his footsteps deliberate as he approached Trevor's table. The man, hunched over, looked up, his glare cutting like a blade, fully expecting a confrontation, but Jason didn't raise his voice or posture aggressively. Instead, he sat down across from Trevor without a word. The sudden, unexpected gesture seemed to throw Trevor off balance. His lips curled into a sneer, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. For a moment, there was nothing but tense silence between them, an invisible line drawn in the sand. "What do you want?" Trevor finally spat, his voice dripping with resentment, as if daring Jason to challenge him. Jason met Trevor's gaze, unfazed. "I don't want anything. Just thought we could talk," he replied, his voice as calm as ever, cutting through the animosity in the air. Trevor let out a bitter, humorless laugh, the kind that comes from years of disillusionment. "Talk? About what?" His words were sharp, tinged with frustration. "About how the world's against me because I don't agree with everything? About how people like you get all the breaks, while people like me are left to rot?" Jason didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he nodded slowly, a gesture not of agreement but of understanding. He saw through Trevor's anger, recognizing it as something deeper, a wound left untreated, festering under the surface. "The world's tough on everyone, mate," Jason said, his tone steady, yet empathetic. But here's the thing. When you push everyone away, you're the one who ends up alone. Trevor's jaw tightened, his defenses rising. "Spare me the clichés," he muttered, his eyes hard as he looked past Jason. "You don't know anything about me. People like me—" He stopped himself. A brief pause where something raw flickered across his face. "People like me don't get a fair shot. We're ignored, forgotten." Jason leaned in slightly, not with intensity, but with intent, showing that he was fully present. "You're right. I don't know your story." His voice softened, breaking through the barrier between them. "But I'm sitting here. I'm listening. Maybe that's where we start." Trevor's hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white, as though he was bracing himself against an unseen storm. For a moment, it seemed like the weight of his anger would crash down again, but Jason's words had landed somewhere deeper than Trevor expected. There was a vulnerability in being heard, something Trevor hadn't experienced in a long time. The cafe around them buzzed with life, but in that moment, the world had shrunk down to just the two of them. "You really think just talking will fix anything?" Trevor muttered, though the edge in his voice had softened. He glanced at Jason, waiting for the answer, but also, perhaps for the first time in a long time, hoping for one. The tension hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating, but Jason remained still, steady. He didn't flinch or react to Trevor's anger. Instead, he sat quietly, his expression soft, as Trevor's story began to unravel before him. What started as a rough recount of life's hardships soon revealed layers of pain that had long been buried beneath Trevor's bitterness. He spoke of his broken family, how everything he'd once loved had fallen apart, piece by piece. His voice cracked as he mentioned the years of struggle, trying to find a place in a world that seemed intent on rejecting him at every turn. The jobs he lost, the friends who distanced themselves, the cold stares and harsh words from strangers who judged him for his outbursts, never caring to understand the story behind them. Jason listened carefully, not interrupting, not offering platitudes. He let Trevor speak, and as Trevor's words poured out, a raw vulnerability started to surface, something Jason hadn't expected. Beneath all the layers of rage, beneath the years of hate, was a man who didn't want to be this way. Trevor's voice wavered, revealing cracks in the tough exterior he'd built around himself. It wasn't anger that defined him. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion from years of hurt. Exhaustion from being judged before anyone knew his name. Exhaustion from a world that never gave him a chance. "I didn't start out like this," Trevor muttered, his eyes dropping to the table. "I didn't want to be this person." For a moment, silence lingered between them. Trevor's defenses, which had once been impenetrable, were starting to crumble, piece by fragile piece. Jason could sense it, the shift happening right in front of him. It was subtle, but it was real. Trevor was no longer the angry man who had stormed into the cafe, full of resentment and rage. He was becoming something else, someone willing to acknowledge his own pain, someone willing to show the vulnerability he'd kept hidden for so long. Trevor continued, this time softer, almost unsure. He spoke of his frustration at the world, but also of his longing for something different. He admitted that he was tired of carrying the hate that had consumed him for so many years. He was tired of living in a constant state of anger. And as he spoke, Jason could see the walls around Trevor's heart slowly lowering. Jason didn't rush him. He didn't try to force a revelation or demand answers. He simply sat there, offering a presence of understanding. He knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was to be there, to create space for someone to finally lay down their burdens. It was clear that Trevor had been carrying his alone for far too long. The transformation wasn't instant. It wasn't some grand moment of catharsis where everything changed in a heartbeat. It was slower than that, more subtle, but the fact that Trevor was willing to open up at all, to show even a hint of trust, was a sign that the seeds of change were being planted. Little by little, Trevor seemed to relax, the bitterness in his voice softening, the tension in his body loosening. By the time the conversation reached a natural pause, the air in the cafe felt different. There was still tension, yes, but it wasn't the same thick, suffocating tension that had been there when Trevor first walked in. Now, there was something else. Hope. A fragile, delicate hope that perhaps Trevor's story didn't have to end in anger. Perhaps there was still a chance for redemption, a chance to heal. Jason smiled softly as Trevor glanced up, meeting his eyes for the first time with something resembling gratitude. He didn't say much in return. There was no need for it. The simple act of listening, of being there, was enough. Trevor wasn't healed, and he wasn't fixed, but he had taken the first step. And that, Jason knew, was the hardest part. Sometimes change doesn't come in the form of grand gestures or dramatic resolutions. Sometimes it begins quietly, in the moments where someone finally feels heard, where the weight they've carried alone for so long begins to lighten. And Jason knew that while Trevor's journey wasn't over, it had at least begun. As Trevor stood to leave, the faintest glimmer of something new flickered in his eyes, a small, fragile spark that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Jason nodded, his heart steady, knowing that sometimes all it takes to start a change is one moment of kindness, one person willing to listen. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the weight in the air shifted. Trevor's shoulders slumped slightly as he spoke again, his voice quieter, more reflective. "You know, I've been so angry for so long, I forgot what it's like to talk to someone without hating them first." His words were heavy with years of frustration, a mixture of bitterness and vulnerability. Jason, ever composed, gave a small but genuine smile. "Sometimes all it takes is a conversation," he replied, his tone steady and sincere, offering a bridge of understanding between them. The simple truth of his words hung in the air. Trevor's gaze flickered to Jason, searching his face for any sign of mockery or judgment. He had spent so long bracing himself for rejection that it was hard to believe someone would genuinely listen without a hidden agenda. But there was no sarcasm in Jason's expression, no pretension. He was there, fully present, his eyes soft and understanding. Trevor realized, with a mixture of disbelief and relief, that Jason wasn't pretending to care. He genuinely did. For a moment, Trevor fell silent again, as though the weight of his own words was sinking in. His eyes drifted around the cafe, taking in the familiar faces, the people who had avoided him, who had whispered and judged him from a distance without ever truly knowing him. The patrons were still there, quietly observing, unsure of what was happening. But something had shifted in the room. The tension, the judgment, was no longer as sharp as it had been. Trevor saw it now. He wasn't alone in this moment. Jason had done something small but profound. He had reminded Trevor that there was more to life than the anger that had consumed him for so long. In that simple act of sitting down and listening, Jason had created a space where Trevor didn't have to fight, didn't have to be defensive. He had shown Trevor, with nothing more than patience and understanding, that perhaps there was a different way to be seen by the world, a way that didn't start with hate. As Jason sat quietly, letting Trevor process, The weight of the encounter settled around them like a quiet revelation. For the first time in a long while, Trevor could feel the possibility of something better, something beyond the anger and isolation he had wrapped himself in for so long. There was a glimmer of hope, a flicker of connection, and it was enough to start changing the way he saw not just the world, but himself. Maybe there's more to me than just the anger, Trevor thought, the idea tentative but growing stronger with each passing second. And for the first time, he didn't feel so alone. As Jason stood up to leave, the weight of the conversation still lingered in the air. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He gave Trevor a final, thoughtful nod, a gesture of quiet understanding. "Take care of yourself, all right," he said softly, his voice carrying an unspoken warmth. Trevor, who had been so resistant and defensive at the start of their interaction, looked up at Jason. His eyes, usually filled with contempt and suspicion, were now clouded with a mixture of confusion and something else. Something softer, perhaps a flicker of hope. His voice, once gruff and cold, now held a trace of vulnerability. "You really don't hate me?" he asked, as if the idea of someone not despising him was still a foreign concept, something too good to be true. Jason smiled, a small but genuine expression, and shook his head. "No," he replied, his voice calm, yet firm. "I think you just need someone to see you, not the anger you carry." His words hung in the air for a moment, a simple truth that seemed to settle into Trevor's chest, softening the hardness that had enveloped him for so long. As Jason stepped out of the cafe, the door chiming softly behind him, he couldn't help but reflect on the encounter. The bustling sounds of the outside world faded, as his thoughts settled on the moment he had just shared with Trevor. He hadn't changed Trevor overnight. He knew better than to think that was possible. But what he had given him was something far more valuable, a glimpse of a different perspective, an opportunity to start seeing the world and himself differently. The walls that Trevor had built over the years hadn't crumbled entirely, but a crack had appeared. And sometimes that's all it takes to begin the slow, painful process of change. Jason's footsteps were steady as he walked away from the cafe, but inside he felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't the kind of victory that made headlines or earned accolades. It wasn't dramatic or life-altering in the grand scheme of things. But it was a victory nonetheless, a small, silent victory in the quiet corner of a cafe, where two men had connected on a deeper level, where one had seen the humanity in the other. It was a reminder that sometimes change doesn't come in bold, sweeping gestures. It comes in moments of quiet connection, in the spaces where understanding begins to replace judgment. And as Jason continued down the street, a subtle weight lifted from his shoulders, knowing that he had made a difference, however small, in someone's life. We all have our struggles, but sometimes a small act of kindness can make all the difference. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the journey. Subscribe to William's Wisdom Stories for more powerful moments of empathy, connection, and life-changing lessons. Let's make the world a little brighter, one story at a time.